Hi, good afternoon. Today's panel discussion, brought to you by the California Asian Pacific American Bar Association, Cal-APABA, is on police reforms and the various proposals and terms bearing on this highly relevant topic, including defunding the police, abolishing the police, qualified immunity, and the role of police unions. Today's discussion is part of a longer series by Cal-APABA and APA lawyers on introspection, action, and allyship between the Black community and the Asian American community. My name is Abigail Zielinski. I'm an employment attorney with Zielinski Law PC. I also serve on a volunteer capacity as a commissioner on the Los Angeles Civil and Human Rights Commission by mayoral appointment. We're very thankful today for our panel of speakers, Alisa Blair, George Gascón, Erin Haney, John Rappaport, and our moderator, Kristy Coleman. Each of our panelists have great knowledge on today's topic, and I'd like to introduce you to each of them. Alisa Blair. Alisa Blair has been an attorney with the LA County Public Defender's Office since 2003. During that time, Ms. Blair has been lead trial counsel in over 50 jury trials for charges ranging from resisting arrest to first-degree murder, as well as a supervisor in the office's juvenile division. Until December 2019, Ms. Blair most recently handled juvenile transfer cases. George Gascón. George Gascón served as Assistant Chief of Police of the Los Angeles Police Department. In 2006, Mr. Gascón served as Chief of the Mesa Police Department. In 2009, he was tapped to serve as the San Francisco Chief of Police. In 2011, Mr. Gascón was tapped to serve as the San Francisco District Attorney. He's been named among the top 100 lawyers in California by the Daily Journal, and the Anti-Defamation League has honored him with its prestigious Civil Rights Award. Erin Haney. Erin Haney is senior counsel at Dream Corp, Cut 50, and serves as the policy director at Reform Alliance. Ms. Haney previously worked as a deputy public defender in San Francisco. Prior to that, Ms. Haney litigated civil rights suits on behalf of incarcerated clients as part of the UC Davis Civil Rights Clinic. John Rappaport. John Rappaport is assistant professor of law and Ludwig and Hildy Wolf Research Scholar at the University of Chicago Law School. Professor Rappaport studies criminal procedure and the criminal justice system. He graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law School in 2006. He's clerked for Judges Stephen Reinhart and Paul Watford at the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the U.S. Supreme Court. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Kristy Coleman. Kristy is counsel at Goodwin, practicing in their real estate industry group. She's a board member of Cal-APABA and leads their policy committee. Prior to her legal career, she worked in federal, state, and local politics and worked in the Judiciary Committee office at Senator Edward Kennedy. Kristy?
Thank you very much, Abigail, and thank you everybody for joining us for our panel on changes to policing. George Floyd was killed exactly 1 month ago today. Since that time, we have seen thousands of people around the world gather in support of Black Lives Matter and to demand systemic changes to many aspects of American society, most intensely with respect to reforms in policing. Today, we are excited to have 4 experts on policing joining us from across the country. As an additional matter, I want to emphasize that we are focusing our discussion today on police reform and not on more general issues of criminal justice reform. Though the issues are inextricably linked, due to our time constraints and to the many considerations to discuss, we really want to try to focus our panel on police misconduct and reform specifically. We also want to note that we understand the phrase police reform has very specific connotations in today's discourse on this issue, which implies more incremental changes and general maintenance of the status quo. But we want to be really clear that our use of the phrase is generally in reference to changes in policing and not as an endorsement to reform over other methods like defunding or abolishment. As our panel discusses these topics, audience members can submit their questions via the chat functions on your viewing platform, and we'll do our best to reserve some time at the end of our session for audience Q&A. So first, I want to start our conversation on reviewing the 3 proposals for how to address police reform, being reforming, defunding, and abolishing the police. Erin, can you start us off by providing a brief overview of these 3 proposals and also give us some of the highlights of federal and state reform efforts that are currently in the legislatures?
Absolutely. So I want to sort of start by acknowledging that while defunding, abolishing, and reforming are all 3 different types of changes to policing, people often mean very different things when they use those words. So I'm going to break down sort of what is, I would say, kind of the most acceptable definitions of those, but I want to encourage people to remember that this is all within a spectrum of how we change very damaging policing. And so when you hear somebody talking about defunding or abolishing or reforming police, it's very, very important to understand exactly what they're referring to, since lots of people use these terms to mean very different things. Reforming, as Kristy just pointed out, generally means making specific changes to a system that is already in place. So for example, something that would be considered a reform would be something that has to do with police officers wearing body cams, right? It is not fundamentally changing the system of policing, but it is making a change to policing that people believe will have an impact. Abolishing the police would be on sort of the opposite spectrum of that, right? So there are many communities in which experts argue police really aren't functioning in those communities largely, and that really most of the functions of police can be done by other departments. And so when folks talk about abolishing policing, they are generally talking about taking away the law enforcement function that we currently use to deal with a number of social problems and replacing them instead with other professionals to address those issues. When we talk about defunding the police, it can mean sort of a variety of things across the spectrum. It means really exactly what it says, which is taking money away from the current police budget and generally investing that money into other departments that can deal with some of the current issues. So for example, using less money in law enforcement and putting more money towards mental health. Over 30% of calls that come in through 911 dispatch are mental health related calls. If right now all of the money that we have creates a law enforcement response, then that's going to be who shows up and what happens if you call 911. So the idea behind defunding law enforcement or policing is that that money would instead go toward, for example, mental health professionals, schools, a variety of other departments and systems that could step in and address some of these same issues, but do it from a different point of view, not from a strictly punitive or policing point of view. And I think to your second part of the question, Kristy, what we can see is we see a number of legislations throughout the country, whether it's federal, whether it's hyper-local, like at the county level, or whether it's at the state level, all of which fall somewhere on this spectrum. Most of them have some type of reform in them. Even if they are sweeping bills, you'll see something like Colorado's law, for example, right? Where much of the law deals with body camera footage. So we know that there have been a number of bills that have required police officers to wear body cameras and to always have them filming. Sadly, while we have seen some of that tragic footage, we also know from cases like Breonna Taylor's that there are many instances where police do not have their body cameras on them, they don't have them turned on, or even if they do not release the footage. And so it can be very, very difficult for families to understand what their recourse is, what happened, whether to believe the narrative of the police when they know that there's a video out there and they haven't been able to see it. So Colorado's law, which is, I think by most accounts fairly sweeping, it addresses a number of different reforms, but you are going to see in there additionally some sort of technical reforms like body camera body camera reform. You also see in a bill like Colorado's reforms to qualified immunity, which I believe we'll talk about a bit later. So you can see it touching on a variety of different areas. When you look at somewhere like Minnesota, for example, there were 48 bills that were proposed after George Floyd was killed. And so in those bills, you can see a variety of different approaches to try to fix and limit and restrict policing. You can see the same thing really at the federal level, right? We have a Justice in Policing Act, which takes more of a sweeping look at how to fix and sort of contain current policing. And then we also have Tim Scott's bill, which takes a narrower approach at this point.
Great. Thanks so much, Erin, for that really helpful overview. Following the murder of Michael Brown and the unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, President Obama convened the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. And that was one of the earlier efforts to outline various reforms that might be necessary and should be pursued by local police forces. One of the primary pillars of the task force's report is the need for law enforcement to build legitimacy and trust within its communities. The report emphasized studies that people are more likely to obey the law when they believe that those who are enforcing it are legitimate, with legitimacy conferred only to those whom people believe are acting in procedurally just way. That's often known as procedural justice. George, within the frameworks of police reform and defunding the police, how can the police cultivate legitimacy and gain the public trust, especially when trust in the police is so eroded within many of our communities?
You know, I think the problem that we're facing today is that I don't think the public is going to be accepting any longer of panels and groups where law enforcement basically is dressing up the issues and you know, talking about additional training and additional funding for officer you know, interaction with the community. I think it's going to be really important for the police to really get ahead of the curve here. The police is going to have to actually advocate for, you know, greater accountability around police violence. That means that the police, and especially police labor, is going to have to stop fighting accountability measures. I think it's going to be really critical also that the police actually starts joining the efforts to create bodies outside of policing and even outside of prosecutors' offices to review police misconduct, police use of force, and if necessary and appropriate, police prosecutions that be decoupled from local DAs. I think finally the police has to be not only transparent about their work, which means, you know, making available body cams and all the other tools that they often work so hard to keep away from the public for so long. But I think you would have to have very thoughtful leadership in policing actually that would join forces with community groups and other partners in the space to begin the process of taking away from policing roles that should be handled and would be handled better by other verticals, whether it's people in public health or social services or education. I just don't know that our current police structure is equipped to do any of those things. And I think that, you know, often major reform, and I'm using reform in a broader sense, perhaps that Erin is you know, describing it, sometimes has to come from the outside. You know, it just, you know, sometimes systems are unable to fix themselves, and you really have to have outside forces and the unwillingness, especially around police leadership and labor, to accept even some of the basic criticism and try to dress it up. I think you know, I think we're at a juncture where I don't believe that the community is going to accept, you know, this effort. I mean, I can tell you right now in my own county in LA, the police and the DA are talking about creating a task force so that all the police agencies will pool their resources. And if there's an officer involved shooting, they will investigate. The agency involved in the shooting will not investigate it itself. Another agency will do it. But guess what? That is not the answer. You still have police investigating the police. And these officers are going to be investigating somebody else today. They know that eventually they may be investigated by the other person. So they're missing the basic point that this is a function that has to be completely removed from the police and, quite frankly, eventually from prosecutors as well.
Thank you, George. Alisa, along the lines of what George was noting with respect to reform in a more general sense and having issues dealt with within other verticals, one of the key areas of reform that you've emphasized is the presence of police in schools and the creation of the school to prison pipeline and how that's impacting juveniles. Can you discuss your work with juveniles and where you think reform efforts should be focused in that regard?
Sure. Well, as a starting point, I don't know everyone else's position with regards to the different reform efforts that we've discussed, but I need to say that I am a complete abolitionist and often have been considered really radical in this area because I don't think there's anything that can be done with the current police structure, with the systemic racism. When it comes to juveniles, my work is primarily most recently with regards to juveniles that the district attorney's office under Jackie Lacey is trying to send to adult court. In other words, ignoring adolescent brain development and all the science that we know and trying to just throw away these kids. There's no surprise that more than 90% of the children that the district attorney's office tries to send to adult court are children of color. So when you talk about this school to prison pipeline and the presence of police on campuses and this notion of school police, they should not exist at all. Because what happens is that discipline then becomes the responsibility of police officers, and the principal and counselors, teachers, et cetera, reach out to police who then criminalize normal conduct or normal behavior of adolescents. And much like the argument for, our mentally ill population or those suffering with substance use issues, et cetera, is that you have people ill-equipped to handle all of the needs and issues that these children are facing. Statistically, without, throwing out a bunch of numbers, but what winds up happening is that children get suspended, children get arrested, children face the trauma. I mean, let's think about how police intervene. They intervene with handcuffs. They intervene with chains. They intervene with removal from a safe space, whether that's a classroom or home. They intervene with these, long processes of interrogation. And because of the way that police see children, right? So just one number, for example, police officers tend to view Black children as 4.5 years older than they actually are, right? And so what happens is that these children are treated as such. And that's why you see all these videos of like 9-year-olds in handcuffs and children crying. And it's such a traumatizing experience that there's absolutely no link between that and public safety. Instead, you have traumatized children whose brain development is being impacted because of that. The short answer to the question is there's just no room for police on school campuses at all. I think any defunding effort, that is the first area to cut completely is school police.
Thank you, Alisa. I did see that the Oakland Unified School District yesterday did vote to defund all of its policing activities within the school. So it looks like local jurisdictions are taking heed of these issues. Erin, have you seen other legislation that are targeting the role of police in schools?
Absolutely. So there's a number of different states and also especially local communities that are looking at the role of police in schools. Even San Francisco, in years past took a closer look, for example, at how police were operating in schools. And we're seeing much, much more of that. I think as Alisa just laid out, it is particularly troubling given the implicit and explicit bias that police have to put them into schools where children can be traumatized. I think she laid it out really, really well in terms of how damaging it is to criminalize really basic sort of human variation in behavior. I think we saw that also recently again with the Elijah case, which was just incredibly heartbreaking. But watching somebody who was very clearly struggling and trying to communicate that they were not a threat, and just imagining how that happens in schools. So I think that we are seeing many places take a closer look at that. And as Alisa pointed out, many places taking that as the first point of defunding efforts.
Great, thanks, Erin. I want to switch gears a little bit and discuss potential impediments to reform. Many analysts point to police culture itself, and Alisa alluded to this as well, that police culture itself is a significant part of the problem. George, you were involved in the internal review of the LAPD in the aftermath of the Rappaport scandal, which was a police corruption case in the 90s involving offenses from falsifying evidence and stealing money to police violence and perjury and testimony. What did you learn from your investigation of the Rappaport scandal, and how has that influenced your views on reform now?
Yeah, what I learned, and that's why to my earlier comments that I don't think police is capable of reforming itself, is that, I, having been in LAPD and having worked in the Rappaport scandal and in the aftermath of that, looking at not only the problem with the culture inside the police department, but also prosecutors, right? Because what we found was that there was obviously officers were doing all these horrendous things, but also we saw prosecutors looking the other way, or at least being accepting of behavior that they should not have been accepting of, and all the way up into the bench, right? And there are some lessons for me out of that process, and then working through actually creating training in response to the Justice Department's work on the consent decree, and really coming to a place where at that point I believed that we were capable of reforming ourselves, and now evolving from that position to the place where I think any serious reform in policing must come from the outside. I just think that there are so many inherent conflicts in the culture. First, we have the role of police labor, and I know we're going to talk about this later, so I don't want to get deeply into it, but as enablers of that police conduct and basically the work that they do in that area. And then you have the way that policing tries to protect itself in general terms from outside interference. So I say view it outside interference, I view it as outside oversight. I just think that any serious efforts to reimagine, maybe, because I'm very conscious of Erin's definition, which I agree with greatly. I think maybe a better term that I can use is reimagine public safety. I think it's going to require outside intervention, and while eventually police obviously has to be part of this, I don't think they can take a leading role in creating reform. It's not about more training, frankly. It's not about more hiring. It's not even about more diversity in police departments. Most of our major cities, San Francisco, LA, are typical example. They're extremely diverse, and yeah, what we see is that even officers that may come from diverse backgrounds and gender, they still get absorbed by the culture, and there's no diversity of thought in the way that you do the work by and large. So I don't see police capable of reforming itself.
Thanks, George. I think part of the conversation in terms of the reform of police culture has been a shift in the mindset that needs to be made in policing from more of a quote unquote warrior mindset to one of a guardian mindset. Is that something that you agree with? And outside of, the training aspects, which you've stated is not a viable avenue for seeking this change, what steps may be taken to really change that mindset within the existing police culture?
Yeah, I tell you, the problem is that, as you get older, you see history repeat itself over and over again, right? We were talking about the concept of policing as guardians back in the late 1990s, post the 1992 civil unrest in LA, and certainly into the early 2000s. Again, I think it's basically relabeling the same basic structure. And frankly, I agree with with Alisa 100%. In fact, when it comes to school policing, I actually, put out a position paper yesterday or the day before, actually supporting the abolition of the LAUSD police, because I don't believe that there's a role for policing inside the schools. If there's an act of violence, certainly you can bring your local police, but I think that when you have police inside the school, you criminalize young people inside the school for behavior that should not be criminalized. The same problem is even in our community at large, is that the way that police operates, the over-criminalization of the community, it's not going to change unless we completely restructure the whole system. And I just don't see police being capable of that. You can call them guardians, you can call them whatever you want to call them. I think it's still the concept that continues to be the same. And by the way, a lot of those concepts that you're hearing, they have been around for a long time. I find it amazing when people say, oh, well, this concept of guardian, it was. I mean, actually, that concept originated in Israel with the Israeli police, by the way, and they came to us after the civil unrest. So it's just dusting off these things over and over again instead of just breaking apart and moving into a different direction.
That's fascinating. Further to our discussion on police culture, John, you had conducted a study on the effect of police unions on violent incidents of misconduct and the role of police unions in policing. Can you discuss that research and your findings there?
Yeah, I think it's right to raise this topic during the section of this event on impediments to reform, because I do think that collective bargaining and police unions have been an effective impediment to reform. When I think about the subject, I guess I think about it at three levels. I think, first of all, they're important players in the electoral realm. They raise a lot of money. They donate money to political campaigns, and they endorse candidates that in a way that can make a difference in some elections. And so the work of police unions tends to result in the election, in the aggregate, not in every place in every election, but in the aggregate, they push us toward having more so-called law and order candidates win office. I think then a little bit closer to the ground, you have the sort of policy level. A city wants to change its use of force policy and restrict the conditions under which an officer can fire a taser or a firearm. They're going to expect that the police union is going to oppose that. And historically, police unions have come out against reforms of this sort, as well as they opposed reforms to try to diversify police departments. I mean, I agree with George that we shouldn't think that diversifying police departments is any silver bullet here. But to the extent that we might wish for diverse police departments for various reasons, police unions historically have been opponents of those efforts. And then I think closest to the ground, and maybe most important, collective bargaining is the function of collective bargaining is to obtain benefits for the members of the collective bargaining unit. And so police unions, they bargain over wages and benefits and things like that, same as any other profession. But they also spend a substantial amount of effort bargaining over disciplinary procedures. And they've been very successful in obtaining a set of procedural protections in the contracts between the city and the union that make it very, very difficult to hold police accountable. When you're trying to investigate the police in a unionized agency, they often have all kinds of protections. You can't interrogate them for 48 hours. You have to show them all the other evidence first before you interrogate them, things like this. And then, even if you're able to jump through those hoops and succeed in disciplining an officer, the officer is going to have back-end protections, usually in the form of labor arbitration. And some recent studies have found that, labor arbitrators are reinstating officers at a rate of about 50%. Now, of course, you don't know from that figure alone that there's anything wrong happening. Could be that 50% of the terminations are, arbitrary and incorrect. But I think that most people who work in this field and look at these cases would say, no, the error rate is nowhere near 50%. And there are many, many examples in which labor arbitrators are reinstating over the chief's objections, officers who have committed pretty egregious misconduct. So my colleagues and I, seeing all this evidence and reading these stories of officers who've done terrible things, been fired and then reinstated, we thought, well, if this is really having the effect on policing that we would expect it to have, then we should be able to pick it up in the data. But no one had ever tried to run a quantitative study to capture the causal effects of collective bargaining on police behavior. We were able to find a rich enough data set and what we call a natural experiment in Florida in 2003. The basic setup is that city police officers had been able to bargain collectively for decades, but sheriff's deputies who are employed at the county level hadn't. And in 2003, sheriff's deputies for the first time got the right to bargain collectively. And so what we did is we measured the behavior of sheriff's deputies before and after they got the right to bargain collectively, and then used the police officers as the control group because nothing had changed for them in 2003. And what we found is that when sheriff's deputies got collective bargaining rights, the incidence of serious violent misconduct went up by 40%. Now, 40% sounds like a ton, and I should caution that the base rate here, meaning the number of incidents that we were measuring before the 2003 decision, was low. And that's because what we're capturing here is very serious incidents. These are complaints that have already been sustained at the local level. They qualify as moral character violations under Florida law, and they're sent up to the state for further investigation for potential decertification of an officer. So it's this pretty rare event, but these pretty rare events go up by 40% when the officers are given collective bargaining rights. And I think this is a rightly concerning result.
That's really interesting. Was your study able to identify anything within the collective bargaining landscape that resulted in that change? Was it specific provisions that the sheriffs felt provided them cover, or was there other impacts of the unionization that you think resulted in that change?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. So, the actual treatment that we were studying was gaining collective bargaining rights and not actually exercising those rights. Because when the Florida Supreme Court gave sheriff's deputies collective bargaining rights in 2003, many sheriff's deputies unionized, but not all of them did. And so the first question we had after we find this 40% effect is, well, is this happening, only in agencies that actually enter into collective bargaining agreements, or is it happening in other agencies too? And what we find is that it's concentrated in the sheriff's offices that unionized, but there's still evidence of an effect even in the other sheriff's offices. And what we say in the paper is that this is evidence of a shadow effect. You're bargaining now in the shadow of a new collective bargaining regime. Before 2003, if you ask the sheriff for some protections against accountability, he just says, buzz off. Afterwards, you ask him for those same protections and he tells you to buzz off, then you can say, all right, well, if that's your answer, we're going to form a union and we're going to bargain over all sorts of things. And maybe the sheriff turns around and says, okay, we'll give you the procedural protections you wanted anyways. And so that's why we think we observe an effect even in agencies that don't, in fact, unionize. And the last thing I'll say about what's driving this is a lot of people who read, early versions of our study asked, is this a deterrent story or is this a compositional story? And what a compositional story would mean is, are the sheriff's offices just attracting different kinds of officers in the post-2003 world where they have collective bargaining? So is it that the same officers are changing their behavior, or is it that we're just getting different officers? I think, frankly, either story would be troubling, but we might still want to be able to tell the difference. And so what we were able to do is actually just drop out of the design all of the officers who were hired after 2003. And so we just look at the guys who've been around before the treatment and then stuck around after the treatment, and we find that the effect persists. And so this really is a deterrence story, that when the officers gain collective bargaining rights, the deterrence that comes from the prospect of accountability went down and misbehavior went up.
Really interesting. Erin, one of the issues that John raises is the procedural protections that police officers have and the potential impact that has on reform and the potential for that to be an impediment itself. One of the issues that we've seen is the doctrine of qualified immunity, which shields government officials from being personally liable for constitutional violations like excessive force. There's various legislative efforts that are targeting qualified immunity, including the Colorado law that you were talking about at the outset of this panel. Can you discuss the impact of qualified immunity and what the bills are that are addressing these issues?
Absolutely. So what qualified immunity means, or the way it operates essentially, is that you will not be held civilly liable as law enforcement or as a government official unless you have violated clearly established law. And I think one of the issues with qualified immunity is that it may sound reasonable when you state it that way, right? We should all be well aware of the fact that we are violating a law if we're going to be held liable, right? So in the abstract, it may make sense, but in practice, it has been expanded so far as to be almost impossible to hold officers civilly liable unless the exact set of circumstances has occurred before and they've been found liable in those exact set of circumstances. And so that's definitely one of the main differences or main difficulties. So for example, in this session, we had 8 cases involving qualified immunity that were pending before the United States Supreme Court. And they range anywhere from shooting of an unarmed 10-year-old boy to the needless destruction of a home with grenades and tear gas, to death and great bodily injury. And one of the things that we saw in those cases was that even very minor differences between those sets of circumstances and cases that had been resolved in the past. So for example, if there was a case in the past where a police officer was found liable for shooting somebody who was handcuffed and laying down on the ground, and there is a new case where somebody was shot while handcuffed and sitting on the ground. Under qualified immunity, a court could very well find that because in this new instance, the person was sitting and not laying down, the officer was not outside the bounds of clearly established law. And so what qualified immunity does is it makes it incredibly difficult to hold police officers civilly liable for things that most of us would look at and be able to say just through common sense that this is something that is incredibly wrong. It's clearly a violation of constitutional rights, but qualified immunity unfortunately shields them from that liability. So what we're seeing across the states and federally are a number of different attempts to sort of narrow in and change this. And so we see anywhere from states saying we need to get rid of qualified immunity altogether. So we see also, for example, in the Federal Justice and Policing Act, there are efforts to get rid of qualified immunity altogether. You also have Senator Braun's Act on qualified immunity, which is an attempt to reform qualified immunity. And so by way of example, what that legislation aims to do is to not take away that shield entirely, but instead to say, we're gonna lower this standard of clearly established law, which we know is basically impossible to ascertain at this point. And instead, we're gonna create a lower standard that says, if you are in violation of clearly established rights, or if you are in violation of case law or precedent, then that's enough. And obviously that's a standard that as lawyers, most of us are more familiar with dealing with. If there are cases that have precedent that says this is what's wrong, normally that is what we would rely on. And so it's really trying to bring qualified immunity more in line with some of those other standards. The only other point that I do want to make, because I think it comes up quite a bit with qualified immunity, is oftentimes the opposition to reforming or eliminating qualified immunity is the argument that police officers are in very difficult situations. They have to make split-second decisions. And so if you hold them liable for split-second difficult decisions, then they aren't going to be able to make those decisions, and it's going to hamper policing overall. And I think one thing that is very important to keep in mind is that we have a number of other standards standards that protect officers from making split-second decisions. Qualified immunity is not the only thing that protects officers from making those split-second decisions. Qualified immunity really is a very large shield that sort of operates to prevent any new precedent, arguably. It operates to shield all new civil liability, and so most of the reforms are geared towards eliminating that shield, but making sure that we retain some sort of understanding about the fact that officers can be obviously in very difficult situations making split-second decisions.
That's really helpful perspective. Thank you. So Alisa, I think one of the other impediments to reform is an issue of public perception and how the public actually perceives police itself as an impediment to meaningful reform. Following the President's task force back in 2015, about 40% of the nation's police departments changed training and use of force policies in the first 2 years after that report was released. Among the police departments that still tout their adoption of the report's recommendation is the LAPD. You've worked in the Public Defender's Office since those changes were implemented. Have you seen any changes since those policies were enacted and adopted by the LAPD? And if not, how is the lack of change within the department, particularly given the department's own emphasis on these reforms, how has that been perceived in the communities in which you serve?
So obviously, for me, there's a difference between perception and anecdotes and actual statistics. So without, completely maligning the integrity of all police officers, I have not seen any shift, right? So the way that my department works, we are often moved around and assigned to different courthouses and therefore work with different law enforcement agencies. And obviously in that context, you have police reports where you're seeing the same officer's name over and over again, and you might either recognize that that particular officer tends to be very thorough, very aggressive, very a host of different adjectives. I think in terms of perception, a lot of that differs by communities, right? So in terms of where I live in South LA, bordering Inglewood, receiving all the labels of underserved, urban, low income, all that sort of thing. The perception of police officers is that they are absolutely no help, that if you call for help, you are going to be waiting hours and hours before they ever arrive. If you are within the community, that they're going to do a poor job of investigating, and you will never have any sort of justice, and also that they bully victims. And so what winds up happening is that there is an absolute distrust and no desire to call the police. As far as when there are changes in the law, and again, not to take away from the conversation dealing with police specifically, but how laws are implemented and what instruction they get comes down from the district attorney's office. So often, there may be reforms or rules and there's absolutely no training on it. One example is that a law recently passed requiring that juveniles under the age of 16 must have a legal consult before being questioned by the police. And it is, a law coming from Miranda and understanding that juveniles don't understand their Miranda rights as given by police officers. So that legal consult cannot be waived by the minor, cannot be waived by their parents. There's no situation under the law where they can have a conversation without having this legal consult. And so what happens is the district attorney's office then sends out a memo saying, have the principals question the youth, don't take them to the police station, trying to circumvent the law. So you would have law enforcement contacting my office because my office, took the charge of being available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to provide those consultations. And having, been on many of those calls myself, law enforcement would then say, I had plenty of officers like, I don't know what to do, and they will call in these different situations where they were really trying their best but had absolutely no training. So I think oftentimes that seems to be the case, not only with police officers, but also with probation and, other areas of law enforcement generally, where the public cries out for certain changes. It might take effect, like when you think of consent decrees and that sort of thing, and then it doesn't trickle down to the patrol officers. So I haven't seen any changes.
Thanks, Alisa. That's a perfect segue into the next topic that I wanted to discuss, which is actually the enforcement of reforms once they're made within individual police departments. George, the federal government has traditionally played a significant role in holding police departments accountable, with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice investigating individual cases or police forces as a whole with patterns of civil rights violations. As Alisa had just mentioned, sometimes this looks like consent decrees or other types of settlements and takes those forms. Do these efforts work, and what has been your experience with this form of enforcement?
I think, and to give you a little background, I actually was put in place to run training for the LAPD and work with the Justice Department during the consent decree to create training to bring constitutional policing to the LAPD, whatever that meant. I think that there is definitely a role for the Civil Rights Division in the federal government to step in when local prosecutors or state prosecutors are not prosecuting or not holding officers accountable for criminal behavior. I think that the problem with consent decrees is that generally they do not, there's a lot of bureaucracy behind them, and I don't think that they really bring real reform. You have really well-intended monitors, you have incredibly committed federal judges, like in the case of the Oakland Police Department, it's been a consent decree now for decades. But the reality is that the behavior doesn't necessarily always reflect the spirit and the letter of the decree. LAPD is a perfect example. Went through a consent decree that was as a result of the Rappaport scandal and kind of the spillover from the 1992 civil unrest after the Rodney King incident. There were, arguably a lot of things that were done that were called reform, and then there was a urgency to get out of the consent decree because the city family felt that enforcing a consent decree was very expensive, paying the monitor and all the auditing that has to take place in order to report to the federal judge. And so we got out of the consent decree. That I was already gone from the police department at the time, but the assumption, I guess, that LAPD have been vaccinated and will not go back to the old ways. And here we are, just I want to say 8 years after the department got out of the consent decree, or maybe a little more, maybe 10 years. And we have seen gang units in the LAPD falsely putting young kids of color in gang files. We have seen, excessive uses of force that are very, very, very disturbing, with very little accountability internally. And we continue to see behavior that frankly is very consistent with all the behavior that brought us into the consent decree in the first place. So while I believe that the federal government has a role in prosecuting people that commit criminal offenses in policing when they are not being held accountable at the local level, and part of the LA issue was, as you may or may not know, there were officers that were prosecuted locally. A jury in Simi Valley found them not guilty on the Rodney King incident. And then the federal prosecutors stepped in and they did get a federal conviction. And I think that's a very appropriate role for the Civil Rights Division and certainly for the U.S. Attorney's Office. I think that the other area of trying to reform police from within with consent decrees, I think it goes back to the earlier statements that I've made, that I just think that to re-envision policing is going to take a lot more than a consent decree, or, you know, unfortunately, really well-intended stuff like the 21st century policing effort after Ferguson, that, you know, a lot of good people got, you know, heavily engaged in it and put a lot of stock in it. But things continue to happen in a way that if those things were effective, we would not be having this conversation today, right? The 21st century policing tenets that LAPD allegedly has adhered to in San Francisco, then we would not have to have this conversation, because all these things would not be happening, right? So I think it's just, look, there gets a point into any system, and the criminal justice is a system, where the standard protocols and the parameters don't work, and you have to re-engineer, you have to create a new system. And I think unless we really get to the business of really moving away from what we created that hasn't been working for years, we're going to continue to have these conversations every 5, 10, 20 years, because there will continue to be system failures. You know, you can't make a prop engine airplane fly like a jet engine airplane, right? You cannot make the criminal justice system be something that it wasn't designed. You know, people talk about even like, you know, racism. And I said, you know, what, I mean, racism was embedded into the system, right? The system has been designed to be racist. The origins of policing in this country started with slavery, right? So you cannot continue to tinker around the edges if you really are serious about moving into a different place.
Thanks, George. So looking at outside of the system for ways to actually bring about reform, John, you have done some interesting research about the role that alternative methods of regulating police might be found in private insurers. Can you explain a little bit about kind of your research on this and the role that private insurance might be able to play in reducing police violence and increasing accountability?
Sure. So we spent a lot of our time and attention, and when I say we, I mean the public, also the media, on the same handful of cities, right? I mean, something like, last time I checked, this was before George Floyd was killed, something like 50% of all news stories in the top 50 newspapers were about LA, Chicago, or New York, if they were stories about police misconduct. Now, of course, Minneapolis and other cities have been added to the mix. But in general, we focus on these huge cities. And one thing that's distinct about these huge cities is that they have a huge tax base, and they pay for judgments and settlements related to policing as they go. They do what insurers call self-insure. They just cover themselves, right? But once you get outside the top 100, 150 cities in the country, and as some of you may have heard in the last couple of weeks, there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in this country. Once you get out of the top 100 or 150, they don't have a big enough tax base to cover all the potential payouts that they'll need to make related to policing. And so they buy insurance. They buy insurance on the market the same way that you buy car insurance or property insurance. And this insurance covers them when they have to pay damages in the form of settlements or judgments related to police misconduct, including, very blatant constitutional violations. So, one thing we know confidently about liability insurance is that it affects behavior, right? If I have a house and I have no property insurance, I'm going to exercise a certain degree of care to make sure that my house is not a fire hazard, right? Because if my house burns down, I don't have any insurance proceeds and I'm out of luck, right? And I don't have enough money to rebuild my house. So I take some care, right? If I buy an insurance policy, and imagine for a moment that my insurance policy just said, you give us $500 a year, and if your house ever burns down, we'll just cover the whole reconstruction cost. Well, then I would probably actually be a lot less careful, right? And I'm sure there's some insurance lawyers, and it's like, you're back in nursery school or something if you're an insurance lawyer, but I'm talking about moral hazard, of course, right? Whenever you issue liability insurance, you create moral hazard. It's this, you reduce the incentive to act carefully because you promise to pay for whatever harms result from the behavior. But the insurance companies, they know this, right? They know that when they promise to pay your damages, they're creating moral hazard, and they don't want to pay a lot of damages on your behalf. So they develop an incentive to try to make sure that you are being more careful. And so a property insurer might come in and might either demand or incentivize me to install sprinklers, to make sure I have fire extinguishers on every floor, to make sure that there's a good fire escape, that the door is not locked, to get out to the fire escape, things like this, right? And they may actually give me advice that will lead me to have a safer house than I would have had if I didn't have insurance in the first place. So when you have liability insurance, as we have for most policing in the United States, you have these opposing forces, right? You have the sort of potentially harmful force of moral hazard that could make the police act less carefully. But then you have the loss prevention and the risk management that the insurers engage in to try to combat moral hazard, which could make policing less risky than it would be in the absence of insurance. And I've written a lot about the techniques that insurance companies use. These insurance companies have very close relationships with the departments that they insure. They engage in educational efforts, training, they do audits. My very favorite anecdote from years of this research was an insurer actually in California who told me that she sends employees from her company to go hang out in cop bars just to listen, see what people are talking about, and see whether it sounds like anything is amiss that the insurance company should want to know about because it indicates heightened risk. So there is potential here. And I've written about success stories where insurance companies have put a lot of pressure on police departments to change, sometimes very big fundamental changes. And actually, some of the insurers in California have been the most proactive in the country. They'll put cities that are having a lot of policing problems on something called a performance improvement plan, just like you would put an employee who's struggling on a 10-point plan. And they'll say, if you don't shape up in these 10 ways and jump through these 10 hoops, we're going to drop your coverage. And then you're going to be left holding the bag for whatever judgments come your way. And if you're a smaller city, that could be very, very difficult for you. So I think that the main message I would want to convey on this point is just I want people to know that this is out there. I want people to know this is not a message that insurance can solve all the problems or insurance is making the world better. It's that insurance is out there standing between the judgments that are stemming from the courts and the police departments that you think are paying them, right? And they're mediating that relationship. And they could be doing it well or they could be doing it poorly. But we should try to learn more about which it is. And if they're doing it poorly, we should try to think about how unexpected actors like a state insurance commissioner could actually have a role to play in either requiring or creating incentives for these insurers to do a better job trying to prevent loss on behalf of the departments that they insure.
Is the incidence of insurance companies being really active in police departments a new concept? Is that a novel kind of advancement based upon recent, policing issues that we've seen, or has this been a longstanding practice of insurance companies?
So, insurance companies are like everyone else. They have attention spans and they wax and wane. And so the insurers that I talk to, this line of business didn't really exist until the 1960s when civil rights lawsuits against police officers became a reality in the wake of Supreme Court decisions like Monroe versus Pape. And this industry developed, and its attention to policing has waxed and waned because a lot of these insurers, when they write insurance coverage for a city, they're covering the city for a lot of different activities in addition to policing. So it could be schools and property and sewers and all these kinds of things. And what some insurers have told me is that you can sort of see the attention flow and it lines up with big scandals in policing. So in the early 90s, the insurers have told me they were very, very focused on policing. And a lot of the insurers that I talked to, claimed a lot of credit for getting police departments to think about use of force policies, to adopt reasonable use of force policies. Before that, a lot of departments just didn't have them, especially smaller departments. But then they admit, we kind of lost interest. And for a while, the big thing was, kids getting hurt on playground equipment at public schools. And we were really, really focused on that. In 2014, they started paying attention again. And in the summer, when Michael Brown was killed and Eric Gardner was killed, they started paying attention again. Payouts for police inflicted harms have skyrocketed since 2014. That's going to get the insurers' attention, and that hopefully in turn will get the insurers to try to get the city's attention if they didn't already have it. So in general, no, it's not a new thing, but it does ebb and flow, and we're at a point where insurers are thinking about this, I think, more than ever.
Thanks, John. Erin, are there any other novel methods of enforcement that you've seen being included in some of the legislation? What about like citizen complaint review boards or other methods of enforcement? Have you seen anything on the legislative front on that? Oh, Erin, you're on mute.
Thank you. There are a number of citizen complaint review boards, and there's a number of legislative attempts to try to strengthen those. I think part of the issue has been, especially when we think about qualified immunity, we allow police officers and government officials a level of deference and understanding that we do not allow to citizens who aren't trained. So, for example, one of the things that we used to oppose reforms around qualified immunity, as we talked about, was to say, look, police are in this situation, they have to make a split-second decision. It can be very difficult. So we understand that police, even with their training and with everything that accompanies that position and that power in that split second and amid all that chaos, can have difficulty making that decision. But instead, when we're talking about community members, right, we don't allow them that same understanding and that same deference. So we understand that police officers may make a bad split-second decision, but if you are the community member with a gun being pointed at you by 5 police officers and you yourself have not experienced any training, we somehow require you to be able to keep completely your wits about you, to be totally calm, to not make any furtive movements or make any mistake. And so we're seeing a lot of legislation that really goes to that, to really trying to understand sort of what should the standards be, how should we evaluate law enforcement interactions in the community. We also know that law enforcement interactions within the community are that first entry point into the criminal justice system, right? So you can make other areas of the system as fair as possible through trials, through phenomenal public defenders, through the appellate process. But if that first point of entry into the system with a police officer is fundamentally unfair, fundamentally traumatizing, then it's going to be very, very difficult to have any sort of just outcome from the rest of the system. And so citizen complaint review boards are one of the ways in which we allow people to sort of talk about what that first interaction is like, and have folks who can actually review what happened there and go about sort of how we can institute those changes. I think one of the problems with looking only at citizen complaint review boards, for example, is what many of the panelists have talked about, and George, especially with his experience, which is there are some things that police are now currently in charge of doing that you simply can't train. So we are asking police in certain situations to be mental health professionals. And while training is extraordinarily important, and de-escalation and crisis intervention training, those all should be mandatory, but they cannot be the substitute for a mental health professional showing up on the scene instead of a law enforcement professional. And so I think some of the limitations, even with complaint review boards, which again, I think are extraordinarily important, is then what do you do to then affect that change and to ensure that you are not just acting on those individual complaints, but actually changing the culture as a whole.
Great, thank you, Erin. I want to thank all of the panelists for their valuable insights into this important issue. As we begin to wrap up and before we start the Q&A, I want to ask each of our panelists, are you hopeful that the current conversations around policing will bring about meaningful change, and that all of the protest efforts and everything that we see legislatively going on will actually lead to changes? Alisa, why don't we start with you?
Shockingly, being, like I said, probably the most radical, I am hopeful. I know, like recently, for example, Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, as well as other organizations, Build Power, Youth Justice Coalition, etc., proposed the People's Budget LA. And I think that we have to acknowledge, as people who study law and who care about the wording of the law is simply the social consciousness of society in that moment. And as we get new information, the laws change, and we shift our thinking. So I am hopeful, because I believe as a country there have been shifts in the way that we see behavior in terms of, are people evil? What, do we understand that substance use is a disorder that can be treated, etc. So I think that we are at a good place of conversation. I definitely think that the protests and the civil actions are putting pressure on elected officials and on people who can bring about these changes. I'm hopeful that we will vote appropriately in the upcoming elections and start to see some change that way. But I think that the conversations are moving to a point where what would have been considered outlandish or a fairy tale now seems very realistic and probable.
Thanks, Alisa. John, what is your perspective on that?
I'm kind of a pessimist by nature. I guess I'm not that hopeful. I had a discussion group with my students yesterday, and they were saying, look, Minneapolis disbanded its police department. And, I said, no, they didn't. The city council voted to disband the police department, but they don't have authority to disband the police department. And the mayor didn't do it. And then the legislative session closed with 0 policing bills enacted. If I didn't teach at a law school and work with the new generation of lawyers each year, I think I would just dig a hole and go lie in it, because I think the thing that makes me hopeful is it's more long run. I think this is a huge transition in consciousness in our country. And I do have faith, if I imagine my students, being the leaders, being the legislators, being the judges, being the heads of police boards, and I could see change. But I think in the shorter run, over the next 1 to 5 years, I don't know. I think you'll see it in some states and some cities will be doing really cool things, and maybe that'll show us some successful examples, and then maybe people will be less scared to do it in other places. But I suspect it'll be slower than a lot of us want. I hope I'm wrong.
Thanks, John. Appreciate your honesty. Erin, how about you?
Man, John, you're bringing me down. Alisa brought me up, and then you brought me right back down. I am hopeful, but I am eternally optimistic about stuff like this. I think that, things that have often seemed impossible in our history have been possible in the right moment and with the right amount of unity and force around it. After the tragic death of George Floyd, we saw over 150 bills come forward on policing. To John's point, not all of them went anywhere. Not all of them did something substantial, but even just making it a part of that core narrative. On the other hand, there are over 1,000 people who are killed by the police every year. So 150 bills is a very important thing. It does not change the 1,000 people that we lose every year to this type of violence. And I guess I think, my boss Van Jones often says breakdowns lead to breakthroughs. And I think that what we are seeing right now is a breakdown that has been decades coming. And my hope is that we will have some sort of a breakthrough as a result.
Thanks, Erin. And how about you, George?
Here we are. I think I see it as we're at a fork, right, where you have opportunity and you have hope and you have history. I would hate to break your bubble, John, but I think if you walked into a law school in the 1970s or the 1960s, you would see the same level of optimism and reform-minded people that later on somehow, get sucked into the system. So I love the fact that you have that great belief in your students. But I think that the people that went to law school in the 70s, and 80s, and 90s will argue with you that they were just as idealistic, and we still are where we are. What I see different this time, and if you can walk with me, I was a young sergeant in 1992 in Watts, and in 1992, this was an African American, maybe the brown community. It was a poor community issue, right? The white community did not get involved. And then we saw other evolutions of this, even Ferguson. I did not see white people marching on the streets en masse saying Black Lives Matter. We're seeing that happening now. And I think that contextually is different than the past. Now, here's where I am haunted by history, because I'm already hearing things about putting these panels together of experts, and police is already talking about they're going to do this task force, and and I think that I'm becoming more radicalized as I get older, I guess, and I don't think I would have ever agreed with Lisa 10, 15 years ago, but I increasingly see the wisdom in Lisa's point of view, and that's why I personally wrote a letter to say that we should get rid of school policing. Of course, I was involved in a whole study around school discipline in Texas through the Council of State Governments that show how poor kids get impacted by school discipline and in the presence of policing and all that stuff, and how that creates a whole host of other problems. But I think that unless we radically move away from going back to the things that we always have done, we're not going to get a different result. And I'm fearful that we're going back. It's easy to go back to, I'm seeing in my own county, the talks about this boards and this groups of citizens and all this stuff. I know there is a definition of insanity that you're all going to laugh because you know where I'm coming from. But I've heard the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And to Alisa's point, I think that we have to completely depart from the past. Otherwise, we will repeat the past. So I am hopeful, but I'm very worried about history. And if we do not learn from history, history will repeat itself.
Thanks very much, George. So we've received a number of questions in the live stream, and if you do have any questions for our panelists, please do feel free to pose them, and we will enter them into the discussion. I'll throw this over to Abigail, who has been looking at the various comments and can provide the questions for our panelists. Abigail?
Sure. The first question we have is for Alisa. And Erin, feel free to jump in. The question is, what was the initial impetus for wanting police presence at schools, and when did this police presence start? And the context for this question is to try to understand what needs the education boards felt would be met with police presence.
All right, so in terms of impetus, it's, in the context of so much of what we're talking about, it's like, oh, with the murder of George Floyd or the murder of Mike Brown, I don't think that there was one specific incident. It was more, again, a shift in the country's view of children happening in the late 80s, 90s, where there was actually a war on children. And part of what came about in terms of that war on children was a term, I think a lot of us are familiar with, of the super predators, or that there were these groups of children. A Princeton political scientist described them as amoral, feral, and subhuman, right? That, and of course, these very primitive animalistic images were tied to children of color. You see this in all of the propaganda and the language surrounding, the exonerated five, known as the Central Park Five, and then just citizen Donald Trump taking out full page ads with his own money, asking for the death penalty to be brought back for these children. And so because of this new view of children all across the country, laws were changed to make it easier to try children as adults, make the age of accountability lower. So you were starting to see different treatment of children as young as 8 years old. You know, in California, the penal code, Section 26 has kind of like who can be accountable for criminal behavior, and it looks into mental illness, et cetera. But also there is the age of, you know, children under 14 presumably should not be responsible. So school police was just sort of one aspect of, you know, these children need a different sort of discipline. They're not normal children. And that's why you see them so often in, again, communities of color and urban communities, because there's this expectation that their normal adolescent behavior should be criminalized. So when you see, for example, someone, you know, snatch another kid's backpack or cell phone, instead of sort of that image of times past of a principal who knows the families and knows everyone and says, you know, just, you know, Johnny, why did you do that? Give it back. And we all move on. Now, all of a sudden, that child was facing a robbery count in the delinquency courts, and the law started to match up with that. Interestingly enough, you know, in terms of the second part of the question and why school boards or education boards felt that the presence was necessary, when you look at the demands of the teachers unions and LAUSD and that sort of thing in their most recent strike, the teachers want the police gone, right? That was one of their, you know, biggest and most clear-cut asks. So in terms of, you know, who's doing this, again, it's police officers conforming to, you know, what society felt at that time and not matching that up with the actual science. Several Supreme Court decisions followed, you know, kind of starting in 1989 and then jumping to like 2005. And again, without boring people with those actual cases, where we started to see a shift of recognizing children as a separate class and that they should not be treated as adults, and the science doesn't back it up, and they are not, you know, responsible, and they may be intelligent but don't have that executive brain functioning, that decision making, that recognition of consequence, poor impulse control, you know, what we all know if we deal with children and have children, and, you know, kids are dumb, like, why'd you do that, sort of thing. And so school police is just one symptom or manifestation of that.
And I'll just add one thing. I think that was so beautifully said. And just to even further support Alisa's point, one of the first times when we see police in schools are in these late 1950s, early 1960s. So after Brown versus Board of Education, we see police then going into schools. And so it always has been inextricably tied to race. Inextricably tied to policing Black and brown children. And I think that we see the remnants of that today. And Alisa just laid it out perfectly in terms of how that still operates today disproportionately.
Okay, the next question, I think maybe John or George can answer. The question posed is, has there been any analysis of why police union-driven protection of officers has been so much stronger than other unions, which are not believed to have a detrimental effect on justice reforms?
George, if you have insight, I'd love to hear it. I haven't seen academic research on this point. I think the academics are pretty siloed. The policing people are different from the labor economists, and I've wondered the same myself. So maybe, do you know, George?
No, I agree with you, John. I'm not aware of any, certainly no research done in this area. I mean, I think that anecdotally we all see contextually the different animals, and they engage in different behavior, both in the way they bargain as well as the way they deal with the sort of legislative process in ways that is different. I think that the only thing that I would say, well, I haven't seen any research. I think contextually one of the differences as we moved in the last 3 decades to increasingly become more punitive and, you know, drawing these lines between you're either for public safety or not, police unions became very adept and have become very, very good at almost any position that they take is good for public safety. And conversely, if you don't, it's bad for public safety. and then labeling people as soft on crimes, which, you know, was in and of itself a political suicide in the 80s and 90s and even more recently, right? So they gain a level of leverage that, you know, teachers don't have, or nurses don't have, or other organized labor, right? Because they can very quickly say, oh, if you're not for this, you must be soft on crime, and therefore you are not good. And then, of course, the war chest has grown tremendously, especially during the 80s. I mean, what people often don't understand, as the size of police forces have grown, the number of due-paying members has grown, and police unions have become very good also being good investors, you know, buying real estate in marketplaces and all that stuff. So you have this incredible war chest, not to bring campaigning into it, but just tell me a fact that is out there. 2.1 million were put up in the primary here in LA County against me, right? And they're promising 4 to 5. They can do that, right? A lot of other unions don't have that kind of cash to do. And you know, so it's very interesting how they exert the very coercive power over the system that other unions do not have that. But as to other, you know, I'd love to see some research on it, John. Maybe that's a good project for you.
Yeah, it's a good question, but your hypothesis sounds as plausible as any I would have. Yeah.
So the next question is directed to Erin. How and when should qualified immunity change?
Great question, and I am hopeful that we're going to see the answer to that soon with all of these different bills. So one way that qualified immunity can change, we talked a little bit about the federal bill, right, which changes the standard for the shield that police are able to use in terms of liability. So that's one way, right, is changing the federal standard. But another way is to do what Colorado did, which is if you cannot change the federal standard, you can also change and create state standards that will allow you to sort of get around qualified immunity. So what Colorado did was they created a separate civil action within the state that would hold police officers liable for violating people's constitutional rights within Colorado. And some of those violations included holding officers responsible for not intervening when another officer was violating somebody's constitutional rights. So there are workarounds that people can create even within the state without overall reforming qualified immunity. There are local things that people can do. I think what we're going to see hopefully is a push both on the local level to ensure that it's happening in everyone's individual communities, but also on the federal level to make sure that overall we are recognizing that this is not a feasible doctrine to continue with.
Okay. And Erin, one more question for you from a different viewer. You had mentioned that 150 bills were introduced regarding police reform. Can you talk about the impediments to the bills passing and what people can do to help? And if any other of the panelists want to talk after you, maybe briefly, they can add.
Sure. And I would love to hear other people's views. I think everybody on this panel will have great ideas about how to help get some of these important changes through. And as George said, sort of reimagining what policing could look like. You know, I think that one of the biggest impediments is this narrative about soft on crime and about sort of fire and fury and law and order for a very long time, even though we've gotten closer to narratives around progressive prosecution and defunding police, there is still sort of considered a real political liability to talk about compassion, restorative justice, sort of alternate forms of our justice system. And so it's extraordinarily important for your representatives to hear from you that this is something that you want, this is something that matters to you. And it sounds cliche, but really when their phone lines are lighting up and they are hearing from constituents that this is important and this is an issue that they are going to be voting on, it does make a difference. And so I would say get involved with certainly some of the local elections. So We've heard a lot about some of the things that are happening in Los Angeles under Jackie Lacey, for example. And so being involved and engaged in a local election, wherever that's happening, and thinking about how the district attorney plays roles in that, that's extremely important, as George will be able to tell you. Being involved in your elections around law enforcement, sheriffs, that's important, but also genuinely getting on the phone, calling your representatives, hopefully when it's safe after the COVID pandemic, or if you're taking the precautions, showing up in your capital and saying, this is what we need. This will determine if you are reelected or not. This is as important to us as any other issue. Demanding that change really does make a difference.
Awesome. Alisa, John, Erin, George, thank you so much for providing your incredibly insightful perspectives on this really important issue. We really appreciate your time and also all of your energy and all of the work that each of you has done in this area. I'll pass the mic now to Abigail for some conclusory remarks. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Kristy, for your thoughtful moderation. And a huge thank you again to each of our panelists, Alisa Blair, George Gascón, Erin Haney, and John Rappaport. Please tune in on Tuesday, June 30th at noon Pacific for Cal-APABA's next program, Together We Rise, Areas of Solidarity for Asian and Black Communities. You can register at tinyurl.com/APA Allyship. But if you've already registered, no need to register again. A link will be sent to you. Stay safe and be well, everyone. Thank you again.